Today, and that we can study or explore through Exodus. May we learn more about you and grow closer to you and be in awe of your awesomeness. Amen. Amen. I'm going to make sure this microphone is on. Yay, it is. Okay. So is there anything that we read this week that you had questions about or that stood out to you?
I want to know more about the magicians.
Oh, yes. Okay, we're going to talk about that. Do you mean why they're doing magic?
Why they're in the story at all.
Okay, yes. We're going to talk about that. There's a reason for it.
The magicians?
The what?
What did you say?
I want to know why the magicians are in the story at all.
The magicians, okay.
So you may not be surprised to know that there's a structure to the plagues. And the magician's role in that is part of this macro structure of the plagues. And so if you pay attention to when they're doing miracles and then when they go away, it's part of the larger structure.
Is it found? Is their story found anywhere but in this tradition?
Of magicians doing magic?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, all over the place, especially in Egypt stories too.
Okay.
Yeah, so also with that, part of the perspective that the scriptural authors are writing from is not strict monotheism. We call it, I can't remember the word, but it is the idea that we worship one God instead of other gods. And it takes a while for the strict monotheism that later comes to kind of take shape. And so one of the things you'll notice when you read the Bible, even in the Psalms, some of the early Psalms, it talks about other gods and their powers. And so kind of what starts out for Israel is Yahweh is one of the gods. And then we get Yahweh is better than the other gods. And then we get Yahweh is the only true God. And so that takes a while for people to get there. Because if you live in a culture that's only polytheistic, the idea of one God is kind of insane. So it takes them a while to get there. And you're going to see that reflected as well. And we live in a culture where we assume nothing magical happens, where this is living in a culture where everything is magical. And divine is behind, like if you're sick, it's because someone divine made you get sick, something like that. We're going to talk about that in more detail, about the magician's role. Any other questions?
Well, I think the whole 5 through 9 kind of bordered on a magical narrative because the Nile turns to blood, and then the dust becomes gnats, and then there's a hailstorm. Well, before that, the rod changes to a snake, and then what else? Frogs overrun the whole land.
We're living in a big land of miracles.
I mean, it sounds like something you would write for a bunch of 5-year-olds, right? It really does.
I don't know. This story has some scary spots, though. I think a 5-year-old might be scared if they read this.
Well, they might be. Yeah, they might be.
But we're living in the assumption the world's magical and the gods are involved in the world. And so our question is, whose God is bigger and better? Which we're going to see unfold. All right. So we're journeying through the Bible.
That makes sense.
Do what?
I said that all makes sense, and once you explained it, it all makes sense.
And so we're exploring through Exodus. So I finally, I think, updated this. So I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. I got them all changed. Don't know why I keep leaving it as Israel. So I want to remember this line because this is the story of the Exodus and why the story of Exodus becomes so important. Because I am the Lord, which is Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And so the story of the Exodus is about God rescuing people experiencing oppression, and that's true for Israel, but it's true for others as well. This is our outline of what we have been walking through. So this week we're in chapters 6 through 9, which in the Jewish lectionary is called "And I Appeared." And we're going to look at the main chunk of the plagues this week. Next week, we're going to finish the plagues, and we're going to look at Passover. Has anyone ever seen a Seder meal before? Has this church ever done like a Seder meal before?
In the Methodist church I went to.
They did? Okay.
Well,
So,
we've done it here. Well, I don't know. I have
a lot of Jewish friends.
have you been to like a synagogue where they've done one before? Okay. I'm playing with the idea of bringing in some of the different spots. Like they have bitter herbs, and it reminds you of this. The bitter.
We've done that.
You have? Okay.
I remember the bitter herbs.
Well, and it's like bland parsley and salt water, and it's just like very like tannic and just in your mouth.
Father Howard did one. Am I the only one that went to that?
I didn't go. I don't know. It was Holmes.
Okay, so I might bring some of that stuff, and like if I brought that, would you eat it even?
I just try it.
Okay, I might bring in like just a little sampling of it because I think it's kind of cool, and we can see how the Jewish community interprets that story. But next week we're going to look at chapters 10 through 13. Are you okay if I move past this? I don't. And this is kind of one way we looked at Exodus, and we've looked at this each week. It's in two main parts. So chapters 1 through 18, and then chapters like 20 through 40, with chapter 19 being in the middle. That's kind of like what holds it together, which is the covenant at Mount Sinai. But this is the outline I gave out on that first week. I really like dividing Exodus into 3 different parts. It just makes it easier for me to read. And so the first part is Israel being in Egypt and the Exodus. The second part is Mount Sinai and the covenant. And then the third part is all about the sanctuary and this renewing of this covenant with the people of Israel. And all of the nation of Israel kind of takes part in this renewal of the covenant. I like dividing it in these 3 sections because there's a special focus on the tabernacle. And I feel like you miss out on that when you divide it into 2. Though structurally, the book's really in 2 parts. And we've talked about how this is all a theme of circling things around. Now, last week we looked at Exodus chapter 1, and it was that genealogy, and we talked about the kind of special number 70, which is to say it was a complete or a wholeness. So all who were supposed to be in Egypt, were in Egypt. It was the wholeness of the people of Israel. And they were under forced labor because a new Pharaoh came to be king, and he didn't know about the Hebrews. It says he did not remember Joseph. And out of a fear of all of the Israelites or the Hebrews rising up, he orders the killing of the young boys in the Nile River. And then there is a Levite couple, which is special because that's the priestly tribe, and they have a son named Moses. And to rescue him, they put him in the river, and there he floats down and is found by Pharaoh's daughter. Moses ends up rising up. He leaves Israel. He goes to Midian, which is a country like, if here's Egypt and here's Israel, Midian is out over here. It's in the south, but it's east, way across the desert. You probably won't survive if you walk through that desert. Moses ends up there, and this is where God appears in the burning bush and says, I am who I am, which is this name Yahweh. It means I am. It means I have always been. I always will be. I am existence. I am being. It's a very powerful name. And the name Yahweh is a version of it that sounds better in Hebrew. And we watched a small little video about this as well. And then Moses is like, I'm not that great, and he has all these excuses. And so God begins to show Moses what he can do with like turning his hand to leprosy and it heals again, turning the staff into a snake. And we talked about in this, Moses is presented as a prophet. He says, here I am, Lord. And that is this calling to actually all of us as people of God to be prophets. We are all to say, here I am, Lord, send me. And Moses brings up his 4 problems, that he is unworthy, that he doesn't really know how to describe God because he doesn't know God's name. The people won't even listen, even if he knows what to say. And then he's like, that should say speak. I didn't fix that. And even if they would listen, he wouldn't even say it very well. And how much is that exactly what we say? Well, I'm unworthy to talk about you. Well, I don't really know what to say about you. Well, even if I knew what to say about you, no one would listen. And even if they would listen, I wouldn't say it very well. But God reminds me I can send anyone. And so that's this calling for us to be sent. Do you want a better chair? That one looks uncomfortable.
Thank you. Sorry.
And so I want to remember this scene just because I find this scene to be very comforting. Oh. So when Moses is at the burning bush, ask yourself, what problems do I bring to God that maybe prevent God from using me? I think it's a good question to ask, and it's one of my favorite parts, I think, when I read the Old Testament, is just how these messed up characters can do such great things. And it's all because they're willing to let God use them. And God's really patient with people, which is comforting for me, because I need a lot of patience. So then we got into Exodus 5, and we heard this phrase where Moses goes before Pharaoh saying, "Let my people go." And we listened to that song, "Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh, let my people go." Okay, that is a review of what we looked at last week. Any questions about last week's material before we move on? Great. Okay. We're only going to read a small part of Exodus. We're going to read the first 13 verses in Exodus 6. Because this is going to lay out... Oh, I'm in Genesis. It's going to set the scene before the plagues happen. And so, I don't know, does anyone feel a desire to read these? Susan, would you mind starting us off and we can...
I was thinking I didn't have the design.
Oh, okay.
Exodus 6.
Exodus 6, 1 through 13. And if maybe...
Brenda.
Oh, okay.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. Indeed, by a mighty hand, he will let them go. By a mighty hand, he will drive them out of his land."
God also spoke to Moses and said to him, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord. I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, and the land which they reside is aliens."
Yeah, I've got a different version, so it's going to sound a little differently.
Okay.
"Furthermore, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, enslaved by the Egyptians, and have remembered my covenant. So say to the Israelites, I am Yahweh. I shall free you from the forced labor of the Egyptians. I shall rescue you from their slavery, and I shall redeem you with outstretched arms and mighty acts of judgment. I shall take you as my people, and I shall be your God. And you will know that I am Yahweh, your God, who have freed you from the forced labor of the Egyptians. Then I shall lead you into the country which I swore I would give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and shall give it to you as your heritage. I, Yahweh." And Moses repeated this to the Israelites, but they would not listen to Moses. So crushed was their spirit, and so cruel their slavery. Yahweh then said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and tell him to let the Israelites leave his country." But Moses spoke out in Yahweh's presence and said, "But the Israelites have not listened to me, so why should Pharaoh take any notice of a poor speaker like me?" Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron and sent them to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to lead the Israelites out of Egypt.
My other Bible didn't say this, but this one has a note that I am a poor speaker. I am uncircumcised of lips. That's interesting. I read this thing. Some of the nuances in Hebrew that we miss is like a non-native speaker. If they read like, "I got a butt dial" or a booty call, and that you miss these like kind of nuances and innuendos that just don't come across quite as well, which are the fun things why you read Bible scholars to dig into these silly nuances. So this is going to be our summary of these first 13 verses, as well as the rest of Exodus 6, and we're going to look at the first part of chapter 7 as well, because to me it kind of all seems like one segment. So here, and the reason I wanted to read all of this, this is kind of the message that Moses is going about in saying. So if you had missed last week, this is all you needed to read, is these first 13 verses. And here, God is going to reaffirm the promise to Moses. Has anyone seen this movie, the Charleston Heston movie? Yeah, the Ten Commandments movie. Okay, so and this message is going to include God's promise of deliverance. And so, if you remember last week, Moses went to Pharaoh just asking them to have 3 days in the desert to go and make a sacrifice to God because they haven't been able to worship God in the right way. And so now the message is that the people are going to be freed because they're under such cruelty and broken spirits they can't even worship God. And here it's going to mention that the Israelites have this broken spirit, and so they don't listen. There's then a section just plopped in there that's a genealogy, and we're going to ignore it this week. And just remember, genealogies are important. It's there for a reason, but for right now, we don't really care. And so at the end of that, though, we're going to see Moses' broken spirit. And at the end of this, and really in the beginning of chapter 7, we're going to see then Moses and Aaron are commissioned to be sent out. And that's kind of the summary of what happens in this first section. And there's a couple key themes that I want to hold on to, and that is God's faithfulness. So even despite the Israelites' broken spirit, they don't believe God. And then at the end of chapter 6, Moses doesn't even believe God because the people won't listen. God continues to be faithful in this. I mean, no one's listening to God, but God is still saying, I will work. I will continue this work because of my love for you in this covenant that I made with Abraham. And remember that idea of covenant, there's nothing you can do to break it. There's nothing you can do to stop this good work. We're going to see this divine commission. And so Moses and Aaron have become agents of God. We get the idea that they're special because they're Levites, but they're also special because they're willing. And I think that's the part to hold on to. We all have this divine commission, just like Moses and Aaron, to be there for other people and to be God's kind of spokesperson. And there's also this theme of broken spirits in the genealogy that we're just going to skip over because there's not enough time to look at it. But it's important if you want to look at it, maybe on your own. Any questions about that section? Because I really want to look at the plagues is where I'm excited for us to land. Okay, so this first part of Exodus 7, we're going to see this proclamation of God's authority. And then we're going to yet again see Aaron and Moses commissioned. We're getting it from two different sources, their commissioning, so it's going to happen twice. And there's this theme that's going to be repeated, which is Pharaoh's hard heart. Every time that Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and they call for them, for the Israelites to be let go, it says Pharaoh hardens his heart. And it's the pattern that starts out, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. Later, we'll see when God begins to harden Pharaoh's heart. God kind of gives Pharaoh over to this hardened heart, is one way of interpreting it. And what we're going to see now is this display of God's power. So this is that scene where Moses and Aaron, they walk up into Pharaoh's court and they demand that the people be let go. And as a display of Yahweh's power, and remember, Pharaoh in Egyptian culture is a god. He is a divine being. And so Aaron puts his staff out and it turns into a snake. And you can kind of, if you're reading, you're like, whoa, that's crazy. Well, then the priests pull out their staffs and they both turn into snakes. And so then you're like, why does everyone do magic? But if we hold that thought aside, what ends up happening to the snakes?
Most of the snakes eat the others.
Yes, and they get consumed. And then the idea there is they can all do some parlor tricks, but Yahweh is bigger and better. And so that's kind of the point of this scene. If you're assuming magic happens everywhere when this is written, and you're in a culture where people do these things, Yahweh's God is more powerful. Because how can a stick eat another stick? I mean, everyone can turn a stick into a snake, I guess. And so what we're seeing here is God's power. And so what we're going to continue to see in all of these themes, and I'm sorry that I'm going to repeat it so much, but God is powerful. We're seeing God's power, Yahweh's power, over the other gods. And we're seeing this battle of the gods through Moses and Pharaoh. And there's this line, I don't know if you caught it too. It's not marked in my Bible, so I can't remember where it is now. It's the beginning of chapter 7, where Yahweh says to Moses, verse 1, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. And so, they are kind of agents speaking, that through which God is speaking. So in the same way, in Egyptian court, the Pharaoh is what the Egyptian God speaks through. Now Moses and Aaron are those agents. And so we're seeing this divine battle take place between Pharaoh and between Moses. Before we move to the plagues, do you think it's weird that the priests are doing miracles as well?
Not after your explanation.
Do you not?
No, it's not weird after you explained it all. I'm sure it would have been beforehand.
I still think it's strange watching them do other miracles. It hurts my 21st century brain, especially as a Westerner. There are still cultures that believe in miracles happening every single day, but it's not the way I understand the world very easily.
I don't think they really did. I don't take it literally. So.
Yeah, that's my question: is how literal do we take this?
No, I don't take it literally.
Well, the disciples healed people.
Yeah, but they are using God's power, where the magicians or the priest of Pharaoh are not using God's power. That's the part that's always confusing, has been weird.
The devil's power.
Yeah, and I think that's one lesson in the Bible, besides this idea that the Israelites took a while to come to monotheism, there's still an idea throughout Scripture of other powers in the world, whether you believe in personal demonic beings or just evil as a presence that we're battling against. But there's hope, despite the reality that there is other power, that our God keeps us safe. And our God can do work and works through us, if that's comforting to you or not. Okay, let's talk about the 10 plagues. Oh, this isn't the picture I printed out. I was looking for this one. I meant to print out this picture because it's better, but I'm going to pass around this helpful little sheet that used way too much ink, so I did not print more than one of it.
Yeah.
But it is of the 10 plagues. I will print this out next week. I lost this picture, and I will try to find it. I like this one, though, because it gives a picture of all of them and a description and the verse where it happens. I mean, it's really great. This one is not as complex. But this is going to be our 10 plagues that we're going to spend a lot of our time looking at, because this is really where the main battle of the gods is going to happen. And at the end, if you want, we're going to watch a 3.5-minute video, or 3.5 minutes of a video, because it's a larger video, that will go in more detail about the plagues, if we want to when we get there. So, just a little nerdy side note about the 10 plagues. In earlier text in the Scripture, so remember Exodus and Genesis and such are some of the last books that are written. In earlier text, like in the Psalms, there's actually fewer plagues. There's 7 plagues. And so in Exodus, when scholars kind of plot it out, they think that the 3rd, the 6th, and the 9th were added in to the plagues that we read. And one thing you will notice, and we're going to mention, and I have it on the next slide, there are 3 triads. And so, 1, 2, and 3 are a set. 4, 5, and 6 are a set. 7, 8, and 9 are a set. And at the 3rd, and the 6th, and the 9th is where a transition happens. And so, we'll explain that in just a second. I have it on the next slide. The other thing that I want to point out about the 10 plagues, and where we're going to spend a lot of time looking at, is they're all battling another Egyptian god, one of the major Egyptian gods. And so each of these plagues, don't think of it as an attack on the Egyptian people. Think of it as God wanting to show the Egyptian people that God is the one with real power. And in these displays, there is invitations for people to turn to Yahweh. And we're going to see that in here. Studying this, it is a merciful act in these plagues. And we'll look at that in the way that they happen. It's not a punishment to the Egyptian persons. There's a lot of chances for mercy. The other thing that's happening in these plagues, it actually is a reference back into Genesis 1 and 2, and it's like uncreation. And so in Genesis 1 and 2, we see God ordering a good world. In the plagues, it's an undoing of that. It's almost like God saying, if you won't worship me or live in my good world, here's a glimpse of when I'm not here. And it's an undoing of the good order of creation. And we'll work our way through those as we go. Do I have that on the next slide? I do. Okay. Oh. Don't look. Okay. Any questions about the plagues? This is where I thought the priest questions would come up. So we're about to explain that. About why the priests do miracles. Any other plague questions?
I wasn't clear that there were 10, but we haven't gotten to all of them yet, have we?
No, we're looking at 7 today, I think. Or 6 or 7 today. Well, there is 10 in total, which is a nice round number.
This is an unrelated question, but perhaps you could elaborate just a little bit. Over and over and over and over, just in 6 through 9, is the statement, and Pharaoh hardened his heart.
Yes, yeah.
And that's repeated. And usually there's a message when things are repeated like that.
So there are 7 times in Exodus that is about Pharaoh's heart being hardened. 4 of them, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And 3 of them, God, I think I'm getting the numbers right, but then 3 of them, God hardens Pharaoh's heart.
Oh.
And so you get this idea, I think I might have those numbers wrong, but it starts off Pharaoh hardening his own heart.
Yes.
And then the way the Hebrew reads, it's God then gives him over to the hard heart. And so it starts off, God is trying to rescue Pharaoh, and then it's like, God's like, fine, if you won't listen, I will give you over to your hardened heart.
You just answered a question I had.
Oh, I'm glad.
Why 7 plagues? Because God was giving Pharaoh a chance. And then he doesn't. No, and then all of a sudden.
And then the plagues escalate in their severity as well. They escalate in the severity, and this is kind of getting ahead, but the plague that actually harms people, there is space given for repentance. And there was a warning given to all of the people. And the people listened before that happened. But we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, so at first, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And then God, the way I will translate it is gives Pharaoh over to his hardened heart. Because it's a little fuzzy to translate it. So in the first set of the plagues, so plagues 1 through 3, the acting agent is Aaron's staff. And so it's always Aaron's staff that touches the Nile or that, does whatever. In the second set of the plague, so plagues 6 through, I'm bad at math. Wait, hold on. 4 through 6. God is directly acting in these ones. So God is doing things directly. And in the third set, it's Moses' hand. I think that's interesting, and I just want to point that out. The other part that I want to show is, in the first set, it's just showing God's power. But all of the miracles are repeatable. And so the Egyptian priests can do it, too. They can do this first set. In the second set, it's showing how Yahweh is the source of power. Because they're unrepeatable. The Egyptian priest can't do these things. They keep trying, and they can't. Are y'all heading out? Love you, Poppy.
Sweet.
In the third set of miracles, the priests are no longer there. And it's because they have become ritually unclean when they get the boils. And so this shows Yahweh is unmatched in power. And so there is an escalation kind of God's own display of power, as well as what's happening with the gods. But you see it in relation to the priest. So the first set, they can repeat all of them. The second set, they can't. So we know that it is Yahweh as the source of power. People can't do this. In the third set, Yahweh's unmatched. The priest can't even show up anymore. And so we're going to see this kind of escalation in the triads. And then the 10th one is out on its own because it's pretty serious, and we'll get to that next week. Does that make sense? How there's 3 sets? Okay. Oh, and I said this before, but the 3rd and the 6th, that's where the transition happens, which is where the editor kind of, has the transition. Okay, so the second part of Exodus 7 is where we're going to see the first plague, turning the Nile River into blood. I'm going to hold up my poster. I wish I had the other one. So here, Aaron's staff comes, pokes the water, and it turns all of the Nile River into blood. And so it causes all the fish to die, and they rise up, and it stinks, and it's gross, and people can't drink from it. And the other thing to note, and I think we forget this one a lot, and this is again to show like this was a miraculous miracle in the story. So it wasn't just an algae bloom that happened in the river, because all of the water vessels are turned to blood as well. And so this is a miraculous miracle. You know, a lot of times, like on the History Channel, they have these shows like there was a big algae bloom and all these things were a coincidence. No, this is miraculous. God's display of power. Even your water bottle in my cup turns to blood as well. Now, thing to know about Egypt, all of life is centered around the Nile. So it's out in the desert, but there's this big river there, and all of life, even still today, is centered around the Nile. And so it was so important that the Nile itself was considered a deity, and this is kind of the lifeblood of Egypt, if you will. This is also going to be a callback. Do you remember how the Egyptian boys were killed? Way back in Exodus 1. They're thrown into the Nile River to be killed. And so their blood is crying out to God in the Nile as their blood was shed. So this is calling us back to this. And so the very first miracle, it's a show on Pharaoh's own hypocrisy, because his role as Pharaoh was to care for people, not slaughter baby boys. And so the first thing that we're doing is showing their own evil as these slaughtered boys' blood is crying out in the river. And it's also going to show Yahweh. And the Nile River was controlled by Pharaoh, like the deity behind it, because Pharaoh is the main god. And so we're going to see this first one is a display of God's or Yahweh's power over nature and spiritual realities. And so it's this big boom in display of God's power. Also, in case you're curious, in the kind of escalation of life, fish are considered pretty low and not really living or intelligent. So even today, like people that are vegetarians might still eat fish. And so we're not really considered killing anything yet. And there's an escalation that's going to happen. And I want to make note of that it's really like, it's kind of shown that it's Pharaoh's fault that all these deaths are happening. This is Hapi, is the Egyptian god of the Nile. And here he is holding cups of water. He's a cupbearer. And so this is kind of the deification of the Nile River is Hapi. Pretty big god. There are other Egyptian gods, even like Osiris. Have you heard of Osiris? So he was another big god, and his lifeblood was the Nile River. And so there are multiple Nile River gods, but here we're seeing this first big god kind of punished. And Hapi is one of those gods that isn't in the Egyptian family tree. He's like a son of Nun, which is like the night sky. So he's like a big ethereal god. And so here we're seeing the first battle of the gods against the Nile. It's a pretty big start. So the second part, and you'll notice this is going to get really repetitive as we go through. But now there's going to be frogs everywhere in the land. This is from a movie, I think it's called Exodus, Gods and King. I can't remember the name of it, but I got a lot of pictures from that. And there are frogs just everywhere. And they come up out of the Nile, and they just invade everyone's homes. They're in their like pots where they have their flour. They in their beds. They've gone everywhere. And there's this line that it affects Pharaoh, his officials, and his peoples. But this first set of plagues happens in all of the land of Egypt. So it happens to the Hebrews as well. And so this first set of plagues is kind of universal and they're repeatable. So we're only just seeing big things happen, but we're not sure yet who they're coming from in the story. And so Pharaoh sees all of this happening and he relents and he says, I'll let your people go. And so Moses stops, and then Pharaoh says, no, I won't. It says his heart was hardened and he doesn't let them go. Also, what's really strange, and it kind of makes Pharaoh paint it out as kind of stupid, is Moses says, when do you want me to pray for it to stop? And he says, tomorrow, not that day, which seems really strange. But the next day, Moses prays, and the frogs stop. And this here is an undoing of one of the first acts of creation, where God divides the land and the water. And frogs are an undoing of that because frogs live both in land and water. And so one of the first acts of creation was to make this clear divide so that people had a space to live in. And now we're seeing that kind of fold in on itself as creation is undone. Does that make sense? How we can draw, okay, because we're going to continue to see this theme take place, where you can think less of it as God damning the land, as God saying, if you won't be part of my creation, look what happens when I'm not here. As creation kind of folds in on itself, is undone, and the chaos takes over. Make sense? Okay. So this is a blurry picture of Hecate. This is the Egyptian god of fertility, water, and renewal. And she had the face of a frog, so maybe wasn't best for dates. She went on a lot of blind dates. And so she was another pretty high god. So god of fertility. The frogs coming here, now we're affecting everything. So the second part we're going to see in Exodus 8 is these gnats or flies or something, or fleas, some translations say, that come from dust. So last time there were frogs everywhere, now there's gnats everywhere. So Aaron takes all of the dust, which you're out in the desert, you can imagine there's a lot of it, and he strikes it, and all of it buzzes and turns into bugs that start flying everywhere, and they're in people's faces and getting everywhere, and it's very gross. And so this is the first of those transitions as plague 3. The priest can't repeat this task. They say Yahweh has special power because Yahweh did this great thing, and Pharaoh is upset about it. And so what we're seeing here is the final kind of act of creation when God makes people out of dust. So dust was this insignificant thing, but it made one of the peak, the pinnacle of creation. And now the dust has been undone to make gnats and something gross and disgusting. And it's spreading, these gnats spreading out, this dark cloud swarming everywhere. It's like death has spread. The dust was where life came from. Now it's bringing death. And so God is giving over this creation back to the chaos instead of the good ordered world.
My Bible translates gnats as mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes. Oh, I can believe that. I hate mosquitoes.
So this also affected everybody.
Yes, this is affecting everyone. And so these first ones are just a display of power. And we're kind of seeing a glimpse that it's Yahweh, but this is the first one that it's not repeatable. We good to move on from this slide? Okay. Oh, this is cool. This is Geb, the Egyptian god of the... Oh, do I have one picture? I think I do. That's not Geb. That's... Wait. Maybe it is. I thought this was the god of the sky. I may have the wrong picture here. Let me come back to that one. I may have the wrong picture. But Geb was the Egyptian god of the earth and the dust. I may have the wrong picture on that one. Let me look at my helpful guide. I got an extra resource for people that want it. Yep, I do have the wrong picture there. I'm sorry. So that's the wrong picture. Ignore that picture. The fourth plague, though, is now we're going to see flies everywhere. This is going to start to get repetitive. But we're seeing a change. So this is that second triad, the second set of 3. And so now it's not Aaron's staff that does it. Yahweh is beginning to act directly. And for the first time as well, this isn't going to affect the Hebrews. Now it is only the Egyptians. And so we're seeing a clear divide. And so here, yet again, Pharaoh says, make it stop. And Moses says, I'll make it stop when you let my people go. He says, I'll let them go. Just pray for it to stop. Moses prays for it to stop. Pharaoh hardens his heart. He does not let them go. And so yet again, we're going to see this undoing of creation. So the call of the mandate after people are created is to fill and subdue the earth, multiply, fill the earth, go everywhere. Now the flies are going everywhere instead of people. And this is Kapuri. So I don't know if it's a he or she, is the Egyptian god of the sun and rebirth. And so they had a head of a fly. And so here we're battling another one of the big gods. Now we're going to come into Exodus 9, where we're going to see the plague of the livestock. Now this is the first one that's going to directly affect animals, because fish don't really count. They're not real animals. And so here they're going to die. The livestock are going to die, but just the Egyptians. And again, this one is only caused by Yahweh. Yet again, it's not going to affect the Hebrews. All the same patterns. And just a note for livestock. So they don't have cars. So livestock affects everything because that's transportation. That's kind of one of their sources of the economy. And it's going to affect the food supply. And so this is a pretty devastating blow. And so in light of that, in this one, Yahweh gives a one-day gap. And so there is an announcement that Moses makes. This plague will happen tomorrow if you don't let our people go. And Pharaoh doesn't. And so it's giving like a one-day notice before this one. Because this plague is an escalation. Does that part make sense? And so it's giving the Egyptians every chance, or giving Pharaoh every chance. And as the other ones, this is going to keep repeating a lot of language of creation. I don't want to get stuck too much time on that. And so this is Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of love and protection that has the head of a bull. And so here, yet again, we're seeing another one of the Egyptian gods. Now, the next plague is a really large escalation. So this is plague 6. We're starting to get into another transition. And this is the one of boils. And this is the first one that affects people directly. And so they take the dust and scatter it in the air. And as that dust goes to people, they are filled with all of these boils. And as uncomfortable as a boil might be, the maybe worst part about it is it makes them ceremonially unclean. So just like when you think of the law for Israelites, they had to be clean to do rituals. So did the Egyptians. And so what this means is that none of the priests can be in the presence of Pharaoh. And they can no longer do their rituals trying to copy what Yahweh is doing. And in this one, Yahweh says, I'm doing this thing so that you will know I am Yahweh. And so here we're seeing a further kind of undoing of creation yet again. Escalation. This one's actually affecting people. But more than affecting people, it's affecting the spiritual system because they become unclean. ISIS, have you heard of ISIS? Not the Islamic State. Yeah, but ISIS is another one of the big gods. And she was over medicine and peace. This is one of the main gods. And so now we're saying, you can't even heal yourselves. And now your priests can't even try. And so Isis is one of the main deities that there is in Egypt. And then we're going to get to the crazy one, the hail and the thunderstorms that cause fire. And so on this one, it's going to include death. And so we have now transitioned into a very different set of plagues, because these ones are now beginning to cause death. And so God is going to warn Pharaoh and all of the land of Egypt that this is going to happen. It says, take cover, don't go out in the fields, go and hide. Oh, wait, I thought I had a different... Oh, I have a picture on the next slide. I like this picture. Let me show it to you. I like this picture because here Pharaoh is hiding, even though he's scared, but he leaves all of his servants out. I like this depiction because even though this battle is happening with Pharaoh, none of them actually affect Pharaoh. They affect all of his servants that do all the work. And here, like, Pharaoh is warned and has seen this display of power. His job, Pharaoh's job, is to take care of the people, and he doesn't order his servants inside to take cover. But Moses warns everyone else, and so a lot of the Egyptians begin to take cover. And remember we talked about in the first week this idea of fearing God? So if you'll read in the New Testament, and a lot in Acts, there's a word that's a God-fearer that's used. And those are those who worshipped Yahweh, or they acknowledged Yahweh as God, but they didn't follow the law. And we're beginning to see this idea. So this is written when the Jews are in Babylon. And so they're using the language God-fear. So now they're beginning to fear Yahweh as they kind of look to God. Oh, this God is special. And because of the warning, God's not trying to punish the Egyptians. God's trying to show the Egyptians that he's the real God, if that makes sense. And so after this happens, Pharaoh admits his sin, and then Moses stops the plague. Yet again, he won't let them go. And I wanted to make a note too. So it says that the plants were killed, and it makes a mention of what the plants were in the season. So the plants that they used were the plants for potions and for their clothes, which the Egyptian clothes was like aristocratic clothes. It was to show them as different. And so then like a common worker. It doesn't actually disrupt the food that they're going to eat. And so yet again, we're seeing a mention of God's mercy. He's not devastating their food supply where they have no hope of redemption. He's attacking the things that divide them and make them feel special. Does that make sense there? Okay. I like this picture. So this is Nut, the god of the sky. This was that other picture that I had on the other one. That makes sense because I lost a slide, and so I must have been back there. And Nut was kind of seen as having her arms and legs in the Nile and then way out in the east. And it's kind of what holds up the sky up in the air. But it kind of makes sense. You think you can see the sky that way and that way, so that's her arms and her legs. And then her body's up there. And so now we're seeing kind of an undoing of the sky itself as it came to attack them. These are the Egyptian gods. We're not going to look at that. Unless you want to. Do you want to?
No.
Okay. We won't look at them. The only comment I want to make is we're working our way up. And so what we're going to see next week is we have started with smaller gods, and we're working our way up. So, there's Osiris and Isis. Now we're at Nut. And then eventually we're going to get to Ra when the darkness comes. So we're working our way up the gods, kind of battling the small gods and working up. And a note I want to make about the plagues. And so they are a display of Yahweh's power, but they're also of mercy. Because the intention in these plagues, again, it's very repetitive, but we're not punishing the Egyptians. It is to rescue them so that they may know the true God. And so in all of these instances, the plagues escalate slowly, and when there is a chance of harm, whether that be to animals or to people or even for death, there is a warning given for repentance. And the moment where people could die, they were given an escape of how to hide. And so what we're really seeing is there is space given for mercy and repentance. It's not about punishing the Egyptians themselves. It's a display of God's power, so they'll see the true God. Does that make sense? Does it make you uncomfortable with a plague that kills people?
Because that's what was in their mind. I mean, I see it as not reality of what was in their minds.
Okay.
That's the way they believed, so it makes sense to me.
It makes me slightly uncomfortable. So I was out when I came back and read this. For this, I never realized the slowness of the escalation, and the idea of mercy kind of stood out to me in this, and kind of how slow it is. Do you want to watch 3.5 minutes? That is a more fun way of looking at the plagues. Okay. This is from Got Questions.
What was the meaning and purpose of the 10 plagues of Egypt?
Can you hear it?
The 10 plagues of Egypt, also known as the 10 plagues, the plagues of Egypt, or the biblical plagues, are described in Exodus 7 through 12. The plagues were 10 disasters sent upon Egypt by God to convince Pharaoh to free the Israelite slaves from the bondage and oppression they had endured in Egypt for 400 years. When God sent Moses to deliver the children of Israel from bondage in Egypt, he promised to show his wonders as confirmation of Moses' authority. This confirmation was to serve at least two purposes: to show the Israelites that the God of their fathers was alive and worthy of their worship, and to show the Egyptians that their gods were nothing. The Israelites had been enslaved in Egypt for about 400 years, and in that time had lost faith in the God of their fathers. They believed he existed and worshipped him, but they doubted that he could or would break the yoke of their bondage. The Egyptians, like many pagan cultures, worshipped a wide variety of nature gods and attributed their powers to the natural phenomena they saw in the world around them. There was a god of the sun, of the river, of childbirth, of crops, etc. Events like the annual flooding of the Nile, which fertilized their croplands, were evidences of their god's powers and goodwill. When Moses approached Pharaoh, demanding that he let the people go, Pharaoh responded by saying, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." Thus began the challenge to show whose God was more powerful. The first plague, turning the Nile to blood, was a judgment against Apis, the god of the Nile, Isis, goddess of the Nile, and Khnum, guardian of the Nile. The Nile was also believed to be the bloodstream of Osiris, who was reborn each year when the river flooded. The river, which formed the basis of daily life and the national economy, was devastated, as millions of fish died in the river and the water was unusable. Pharaoh was told, "By this you will know that I am the Lord." The second plague, bringing frogs from the Nile, was a judgment against Hecate, the frog-headed goddess of birth. Frogs were thought to be sacred and not to be killed. God had the frogs invade every part of the homes of the Egyptians, and when the frogs died, their stinking bodies were heaped up in offensive piles all throughout the land. The third plague, gnats, was a judgment on Set, the god of the desert. Unlike the previous plagues, the magicians were unable to duplicate this one and declared to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." The fourth plague, flies, was a judgment on Uaget, the fly god. In this plague, God clearly distinguished between the Israelites and the Egyptians, as no swarms of flies bothered the areas where the Israelites lived. The fifth plague, the death of livestock, was a judgment on the goddess Hathor and the god Apis, who were both depicted as cattle. As with the previous plague, God protected his people from the plague, while the cattle of the Egyptians died. God was steadily destroying the economy of Egypt, while showing his ability to protect and provide for those who obeyed him. Pharaoh even sent investigators to find out if the Israelites were suffering along with the Egyptians, but the result was a hardening of his heart against the Israelites. The sixth plague, boils, was a judgment against several gods over health and disease: Sekhmet, Sunu, and Isis. This time, the Bible says that the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. Clearly, these religious leaders were powerless against the God of Israel. Before God sent the last three plagues, Pharaoh was given a special message from God. These plagues would be more severe than the others, and they were designed to convince Pharaoh and all the people that there is none like me in all the earth. Pharaoh was even told that he was placed in his position by God, so that God could show his power and declare his name through all the earth. As an example of his grace, God warned Pharaoh to gather whatever cattle and crops remained from the previous plagues and shelter them from the coming storm. Some of Pharaoh's servants heeded the warning, while others did not. The seventh plague, hail, attacked Nut, the sky goddess, Osiris, the crop fertility god, and Set, the storm god. This hail was unlike any that had been seen before. It was accompanied by a fire which ran along the ground, and everything left out in the open was devastated by the hail and fire. Again, the children of Israel were miraculously protected, and no hail damaged anything in their lands. Before God brought the next plague, he told Moses that the Israelites would be able to tell their children of the things they had seen God do in Egypt and how it showed them God's power. The eighth plague, locusts, again focused on Nut, Osiris, and Set.
That's too far. We haven't gone that way. Okay. So that's just another glimpse of how it's attacking all of the different gods. This won't let me go. Okay, that is the end of what we have looked at for today. Was this too heavy of things to look at, or too heady, or anything? Okay, I think it's really cool to look in detail, not only of this battling different Egyptian deities, but also this undoing of creation. Because to me, it really is like God is like, if you won't worship me, if you won't be part of my good creation, then look what happens when I let go and I undo this good world that I have made. And that's encouraging because it happens slowly with God to give us a chance to be a part of the good creation, but also we become the partakers of this good creation and hopefully we get to share it and spread it. Any final questions on what we looked at today?
So if we apply that to our life.
I was thinking the same thing
Yeah.
today, how badly things in the natural world.
Yeah.
And the storms and the floods and the relentless fires and, I kept thinking earthquakes.
Well,
on and worse
Slowly.
and more frequently
And wars. But we're
Yeah.
still not paying attention.
No, and I think it's a fair question to ask is what are the gods of our culture?
Power
And so,
greed.
yeah, our own power and greed, our own consumerism, our own like unchecked capitalism and search for profit at the expense of others. Like we can ask all of these questions of what are those things that are our own gods. And then we can, like in a lot of ways, we are like the Egyptians or we're like the Israelites who won't wake up. And so a lot of this is a wake-up call. And so you look around you and you go, are these things wake-up calls around me? And will I pay attention?
Climate change, the deniers.
Yeah. And we are even in that, we are watching uncreation in front of us.
the collapse of the
Yeah.
gifts of nature and all. It's just
And so it's humans that will be destroyed.
And we're given chance
the
and
earth
chance
will
and chance.
be able to regenerate, just like it did during.
You know, it's like when you have a fever, and you burn out the germs. We're the germs. When we're supposed to be the caretakers, part of being in the image of God is to be the caretaker of creation. I think those are good parallels to draw into this.
We'll go back to what's our purpose here.
We hope to be good caretakers.
And love your neighbor and God. Are we doing that? Very well.
We need to be more prophets.
Yeah.
We need to be more prophetic too.
Yeah, I won't go back to that slide, but I'm stuck with that part of Moses. I'm unworthy.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know how to describe you. Well, even if I knew, I don't know, they won't listen. And even if they will listen, I won't say it very well. Because it's like, oh, that's the exact same patterns that we have.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, so like I am nothing.
Yeah. That God uses the smallest things, even in that.
Yeah. God uses all of us. We open ourselves up.
So this is the phrase, and I appeared, which hopefully makes more sense now, because we're seeing this display of God's power. Next week we're going to see the section that's called Come. And again, that's just how it starts off. So that's chapters 10 through 13.
So your original timeline is
I think
because you have September 28th.
I skipped
Special
it.
offering.
Is the 28th next week? Oh, it is next week is the 28th. No, the 21st. Next week's the 21st. Yeah.
You don't even have the 21st.
Yeah, I skipped it. So the 21st, we're going to look at this. The 28th, we're going to do the special offering. I missed a week in my schedule. Because the fourth week, we'll either do a catch-up or like take an Exodus break because a lot of people are gone doing fish.
So what does bow mean?
It means come. Nancy.
Bow means come? Oh,
And that's it.
Just in time.
Oh, thank goodness.
We're done.
We're done. Am I an hour late?
Yes.
Yeah, it's almost one.
I did that too.
Oh.
I can do an abridged version with you though. I have all my slides.
Oh, of course. But how in the world did I do that?
It's being recorded though, right?
It is, but I can do a 10-minute version. I can skip through some of the
Did you do
slides.
the same thing, Susan?
Not today, another day.
and I come on the wrong day.
We don't have to look in detail on each plague, but we can do a little shortened version of it.
It's plague day. So,